Another case we are going to tell you about today happened in Argentina. Let's find out the details of this story. Angelica Suarez was born in 1996 in the province of Misiones, Argentina. She grew up in a modest home, along with 11 siblings, among whom she was one of the youngest. Her parents, Marcelina and Teresa, who preferred the peace and quiet of the countryside, chose to live in the countryside near the small town of Soberbio, with a population of about 5,000 on the border between Argentina and Brazil. The Suarez family home was about 15 kilometers from the town center. The couple farmed the land and raised animals. Angelica's favorite occupation was boxing. She took her training very seriously and devoted a lot of time to it. Her mother claimed that Angelica was an excellent daughter, a caring sister, and a good-natured person who was very much loved by others. In her youth, the girl fell in love with a young man who was 5 years older than her. At the age of 17, she left her father's house and moved in with 22-year-old Juan Oscar Baumgarten. Juan Oscar attended school for only 4 years, receiving an elementary education, and as an adult, he devoted himself to working as a mason. This forced him to travel frequently to the provincial capital of Posadas, located 240 kilometers from the neighborhood of Itati, where the young family rented a small house. It was the year 2013, and all was well in the couple's life. A year and a half later, in January 2015, they had a daughter, Sabrina. Soon the situation in the family began to heat up. Angelica and Juan began to quarrel often, and did it quite loudly, without embarrassing anyone. Neighbors often heard the noise and screams coming from their house. At that time, Angelica's brother, Jose Suarez, began living with his girlfriend. The couple repeatedly witnessed Juan Oscar's inappropriate behavior towards his partner. Jose told Teresa, his mother, that his son-in-law is not at all like what they take him for, that he is very jealous and aggressive. Angelica, unable to withstand the pressure from Juan, finally shut down and, without trying to resist, submissively endured the abuse. In August, a tragedy occurred in the Suarez family, which greatly affected the young woman. Relatives noticed that Angelica was deeply worried, often crying and sad, but since this had not happened to her before, they decided that it was because of her brother, who had been in a traffic accident. The relatives did not realize that their son-in-law Juan, a tyrant and despot, allowed himself too much and could attack Angelica with fists even without reason. In March of the new year, neighbors again heard a loud quarrel, but, as usual, did not interfere and did not contact the authorities. Since then, however, something changed in Angelica's mind, and she finally decided to break the silence. The woman filed a complaint of gender-based violence by her roommate. At the time, she was 20 years old, and he was 25. Juan got a restraining order, but since he was always strong in the art of manipulation, he managed to convince Angelica that he needed to return home. He said that it was impossible to traumatize little Sabrina, as it was important for the girl's proper development to have her father around. There are reports that the man soon attacked the young woman again, and she filed another report of violence. This was in June of 2016. Although they lived under the same roof, Angelica ended all relations with him and began dating her boxing coach, Walter Saper, who was 37 years old. They shared a common passion for boxing and saw each other daily at training sessions. The man was single, but he also had a young daughter living with him. These happy coincidences encouraged the couple and they decided to move to Argentine Patagonia, and there they began to live and work together. Angelica's family was aware of the fact that her relationship with Juan Oscar was not going through the best of times, and we can even say that it was already over. Later, those close to her admitted that they knew that the woman was dating Walter. On Monday, June 13, 2016, Joshua, Angelica's brother, went to her house after work and noticed that she was not there. This struck him as a little odd. Joshua waited, but his sister never returned, although she was a very devoted mother and could not leave her daughter for long. On Tuesday, June 14, Juan Oscar went to the police and reported that Angelica had left home with a suitcase full of clothes. He did not go into details, only adding that the suitcase belonged to him and that he used it when traveling for work. Joshua had not heard from his sister for 2 days, so he decided to tell his parents. However, his brother-in-law insisted that there was no need to do so, because Angelica would be here soon. A worried Joshua continued to say that something was wrong, and then Juan offered him a motorcycle in exchange for his silence. Still, the woman's disappearance was reported to the police and loved ones. Relatives called friends of acquaintances, searched the nearby neighborhood, but found nothing suspicious. However, everyone who knew Angelica agreed that this behavior of the woman was very strange. She left her young daughter in the care of her partner and disappeared without telling anyone. Almost a month had passed, and there had been no news from her. On the 6th of July, 2 17-year-old boys were fishing in a tributary of the Uruguay River, which flows through a large area near the Brazilian border, at about 11 o'clock in the morning. According to their testimony, the two were aboard a canoe when the hook of one of them's fishing rod caught on something. The boys swam closer and saw an object through the clear water. Looking closer, they realized that there was a suitcase lying on the bottom, with a leg and a head sticking out of it. The terrified boys immediately reported the scary find to the authorities. Police investigators immediately arrived at the said location, lifted the body from the river bottom, and transported it to the forensic morgue in Posadas for necessary investigations. The first thing they wanted to know was the identity of the victim and the cause and time of her death. Despite the high degree of decomposition of the body, at the autopsy, the experts were able to establish what the unfortunate woman died of, namely, mechanical compression asphyxia. The woman's neck was tightly tied with a scarf that partially covered her mouth. In addition, experts were able to determine that she was already dead when she was thrown into the water. The experts could not say anything about the details of her injuries. The scarf proved to be an important element in identifying the victim because it belonged to Angelica Suarez, and those who saw her shortly before her disappearance remembered that she was wearing it. It was possible to establish that the murder took place between the 11th and 13th of June 2016. This date coincided with the date of the report that Juan had written to the police about his cohabitant leaving the house. Angelica's family was summoned to identify the corpse. After that, no one had any more doubts. The case of Angelica's disappearance turned into a murder case. Juan was arrested a few hours after the discovery of the corpse. Angelica's relatives and neighbors considered him the main suspect from the day the woman stopped contacting him, but also behind bars was Walter, a boxing coach with whom his ward was having an affair. Juan tried to frame Walter, claiming he was one of the last people to see Angelica alive. The police obtained permission to search Juan's home. A trained dog was brought into the case and found traces of blood. The evidence was crucial to the investigation. 4 more searches were conducted at relatives' homes, during which detectives seized items of clothing, cell phones, and diaries. They were trying to determine what Angelica was doing and who she was communicating with on social media and cell phones before she disappeared. The first version of the investigation was that Juan took his partner's life in a fit of jealousy after learning that she had entered a new relationship and was about to move to another city. According to the second version, Walter demanded that Angelica start living with him, but she did not agree, for which she was killed. And yet the behavior of the coach was not like the behavior of the perpetrator of the crime. He tried his best to find out anything about Angelica, supported her family, and helped in the search. From the very beginning of the investigation, Walter took a firm stand and defended himself, claiming his innocence. He constantly cooperated with the authorities and even provided facts that proved his non-involvement in the murder. In addition, the man was the first to inform Angelica's mother about the discovery of the body. He then left his phone numbers to the police so they could conduct all the necessary forensic tests, gave them the passwords to his social media accounts, and handed over surveillance videos from the stores he stopped by on those days, and even from the transportation terminal, so investigators could check all his movements. Walter's attempts to prove that he had nothing to do with the crime and that he was really worried about Angelique when she disappeared had the desired result. On September 14, 2016, about 2.5 months after the body was discovered. Prior to that, the athlete had been suspended, but since all the evidence gathered pointed to Juan Oscar as the prime suspect, Walter's attorney secured her client's reinstatement a few months later. She proved that the coach was only connected to the case to get the murder solved or ruled out. Given that not only her relatives but also Juan knew about Walter's connection to Angelica, all eyes focused on him. That's how the investigative process began. The first thing that caught the eye of the detectives was the restriction ordering the man not to live in the same house with Angelica, and the restraining order issued to him due to complaints of violence. But Juan did not comply with the authorities' demands. His explosive temper and desire to control everything prevented him from doing so. As the investigation began, detectives attempted to reconstruct his behavior in the days after Angelica disappeared, and that's when a key witness came forward. Miguel Angel Pereira, a 22-year-old cab driver, claimed that on June 13th he had done a favor for Juan, who got into his car. The passenger was carrying a heavy suitcase and asked him to drive him to a location fairly close to the river where the body was later found. During oral arguments at the preliminary familiarization stage of the case, it was revealed that the testimonies of Miguel Angel and Juan Oscar were radically opposite. However, one of the testimonies was found to be completely consistent with the evidence and proofs gathered during the investigation of the case. When the suspect was asked to describe the route of the cab he took the route through the interior streets of the neighborhood, with its terminus at the corner of a house because the vehicle could not climb the slope strewn with loose rocks. Miguel Angel, however, claimed that he drove straight down the main alley until he reached the block where he dropped Juan Oscar off in front of the house. The most important contradiction was as follows. The suspect said that was the end of the trip, but the driver denied saying that. He said the passenger had asked him to drive as close to the yard as possible, explaining that he had been away and now needed to load tools he intended to take to the woodworking shop. But the terrain was high and the car could not get close. Miguel Angel alleged that the defendant came out of the house with a large suitcase, put it in the trunk, and together they went to the bridge where Juan stopped the driver, paid the toll, and pulled the suitcase out with difficulty. He then carried the heavy load down the path and was soon out of sight. 3 weeks later, the victim's body was found in a tributary of the river. On March 6, his return to his home neighborhood meant nothing to anyone. Even his mother Maria chose not to see her son. The place where the investigation took place was near her home, but she did not come out or even look out of the window to see her son, who repeatedly looked for her. When Maria was interviewed about this attitude, she did not give an explanation for her indifference, but simply said that she knew her son was innocent because she had brought him up very well. Miguel Angel's testimony was crucial because he not only provided accurate information about the transportation of the suspect and the cargo, but was also able to identify the suitcase. The guy explained that the trunk of the car was broken and he had to support it while Juan pulled out the suitcase, which was apparently very, very heavy. It was at this time that Miguel examined it to the smallest detail. Through this testimony, it became very clear that the suspect was carrying a large suitcase, and there was a possible connection to the crime. With all this evidence, proof and material obtained, Juan Oscar was charged with aggravated murder. The latter determination was due to a history of domestic violence, and because the man continued to be in a home in which he was prohibited from residing. The trial was set for October 2019. Several months before the trial began, Angelica's former partner went on a hunger strike in prison. His goal was to get a speedy trial under an agreement with the prosecutor's office, in which he would plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. But the prosecutor's office found such an exchange unacceptable because Juan was facing a life sentence due to the large amount of evidence and would have to plead guilty. His hunger strike was called unheard of impertinence. Even more outrageous was his voiced desire to plead guilty in exchange for a 7-year prison sentence. Because the court did not agree with Juan, he never pleaded guilty, and the case was sent to criminal court. An even longer trial was begun, during which the parties presented their arguments to the jury. A total of 11 witnesses testified, including a neighbor who claimed that she had never seen Juan beat his cohabitant, but the testimony of another neighbor, Erica, who was also Angelica's boxing partner, detailed that she complained to her when Juan cut her with a knife. Angelica admitted to Erica that their relationship was very strained. They often quarreled, and she endured beatings. A friend of the deceased stated that Angelica and Juan had an argument in the days before her disappearance because he blamed her for an affair she allegedly had with Walter, and she responded that she was no longer going to answer to him for her actions. All 3 witnesses said the couple was no longer in a relationship, each was on their own, but they lived together because of their young daughter, to whom they were both parents. Angelica's family also testified. The woman's mother, Teresa, said she initially believed her son-in-law was innocent and visited him at the police station, but he wouldn't even look at her when she tried to talk to him. Teresa later recalled that a few days before the murder, over dinner, Juan had said over and over again that Angelica would not live with anyone but him. To Marcelina, the father of the deceased, claimed that his daughter could not have left of her own free will. and recalled that during a visit to his son-in-law, the latter had cried, assuring him that he was innocent and saying that the real culprit was the boxing teacher. Now, however, Marcelina no longer believes a word he says. During his appearance at the trial, Juan denied the charges against him and refuted all the testimony of the cab driver, which was some of the most valuable evidence against him. He insisted that he had bought a suitcase at the supermarket quite different from the one mentioned, and that he had made only one trip. At the trial, he tried to make himself look like a victim, claiming that he did not understand why the cab driver Miguel was telling untruths. Juan admitted that his relationship with Angelica had deteriorated, but according to him, the reason was not jealousy. He also stated that there may have been more than just a professional relationship between his cohabitant and Walter. Angelica often left unannounced, and if he was jealous, he would not have allowed her to attend training. Regarding the complaint that had gotten Juan evicted from the house, he replied that Angelica had hurt her own arm and had unfairly blamed him. He was then asked what he would say about the restraining order, under which he had no right to live with Angelica, and which he had flagrantly violated. Juan replied that no one had not notified him to leave the house, although he admitted that a police officer had handed him a paper saying so, but he said he had not read it. Of that ill-fated day, the 13th of June, the man narrated as follows. He had worked in the morning, and at noon he came home, had lunch with Angelica, and went to take a nap. When he awoke, the woman was not in the house. She could have gone somewhere and come back, so Juan waited for her for a while and then took his daughter to her mother. After that, he went to the supermarket. The last witnesses were Ramirez and Willis, the boys who came across the corpse in the river on July 6, 2016. They gave the court a detailed account of their discovery. From the indictment filed by the prosecutor and read in court, it was concluded that the crime was committed on the afternoon of June 13th. The forensic evidence established that the victim's cell phone last worked at 11 o'clock 17 minutes that day, at the home of Angelica and Juan. It is believed that the defendant strangled the woman that afternoon, and when she no longer showed signs of life, immediately placed the corpse in a suitcase. This would otherwise have been impossible because of rigor mortis. Then he took a nap next to his daughter Sabrina, and in fact, the autopsy determined that there was undigested food in Angelica's stomach, indicating that the woman had been killed just after lunch. After waking up, Juan got up, took his daughter to her mother, and went to work. In the afternoon, he shopped at the supermarket and ordered a cab. Miguel Angel arrived at the call. In front of the house, Juan asked the driver to pull into the garage, but the car was very low, and he could not do it. Then the man with great difficulty carried a suitcase out of the garage, placed it in the trunk of the car, and asked to make another trip to transfer some tools to a carpentry shop near the bridge. There, Juan took the suitcase out of the trunk and walked down the path to the river, where Angelica's corpse was later found. Thus, it was established that the purchases in the store were an excuse to drive with them to the house itself and then take out a heavy suitcase. Other evidence was presented in court, including a cell phone forensic examination report and the results of an autopsy performed by a forensic medical examiner. All studies confirmed that the perpetrator was of sound mind and remained cold-blooded when he planned and committed the murder. On the 4th of October, 1919, the final verdict was handed down. The Criminal Court of First Instance sentenced Juan Oscar Baumgarten to life imprisonment for the aggravated murder of Angelica Suarez, the mother of his daughter. the man must serve at least 35 years behind bars before he is eligible for parole. In April 2021, Juan's defense filed a tangential appeal, that is, demanded a review and reversal of the verdict, arguing that the court did not specify the day, time, and circumstances in which the murder of the woman was committed. Juan's genetic material was not collected, and no aggravating circumstances should have been applied to him, since he and Angelica were no longer in a relationship. But the highest court of justice, which is the name of the highest judicial body in the country, rejected this claim and upheld the judgment handed down by the criminal court in 2019. While Juan is serving his sentence, the relatives of little Sabrina are fighting for custody of the child. Before the trial, the girl was in the care of Maria, her paternal grandmother, since Juan transferred her parental rights. However, Angelica's parents filed a custody suit in court. Maria insisted that her granddaughter should stay with her forever, because she lived next door and took care of her for so long that Sabrina allegedly recognized her as her own mother. Besides, the grandmother always gets sad when the girl is not around. But Angelica, according to her mother-in-law, could not be called a good mother. The second grandmother, Teresa, noted that only she could fully meet the material and emotional needs of the child. One cannot overlook the fact that the granddaughter grew up in the family of a criminal, and this can have a devastating effect on her psyche in the future. Unfortunately, we do not know the court's decision on the girl's case.
"12-year-old Heather Nicole Coulorn, a cute girl with blonde hair and 3 earrings in each ear, was a real soul of the company. The girl was born on March 9, 1987, to Christina Coulorn. She has a brother. He is 3 years older. Heather did not know her father. He took no part in her upbringing. Her mother raised 2 children and alone. Nevertheless, Heather did not feel the lack of attention from her loved ones. She had a loving mother, an older brother, and several cousins, aunts and uncles. The girl was not at all lacking in love. Heather grew up in a large family in American St. Louis, and her mother Christine tried to give her daughter everything possible. They lived poorly but friendly. At the age of 12, Heather was already experimenting with her appearance. She dyed her hair and even accidentally shaved off her eyebrows. She wanted to pluck them, but something went wrong. Also, Heather was never one to mince words. However, she wasn't a rebel. She didn't run away from home or fight with her mother. She was just in search of herself. Of any incidents that happened to her at that time, we can only remember that Heather was once caught with a cigarette in her hand. The girl had tried smoking for the first time, and her mother scolded her for it. Another important point was that Heather was left for a second year in the 6th grade. But it was not because of bad grades or unsatisfactory behavior. At the beginning of that school year, the girl became ill. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Heather spent a lot of time in the hospital and missed part of the school program. Because of this, she was left for a second year. Of course, it is very difficult for a child to come to terms with the fact that he suddenly has a chronic disease with which it is now very difficult to live. The world suddenly seems unfair and wants to find an answer to the question of why this happened to her. Perhaps it was because of this that Heather experimented with cigarettes and with her appearance, so that at least something was within her control. And of course, she already wanted independence and freedom. What's interesting is that Heather has always adored children. She enjoyed babysitting her cousins, playing and spending all her free time with them. So when family friends Christopher Herbert and Dana Madden had a daughter, Heather enjoyed going to visit them and looking after her. It is not known how much they paid her for this, but Hedda was definitely willing to babysit. Besides, she already had a lot of experience with children. She often stayed with her nieces and nephews. Well, and in general, in America, leaving a teenager with a baby is quite normal practice. But 12 years old, of course, is still a bit early. It's quite a young age. The relationships of 43-year-old Christopher, 23-year-old Dana, and mother Hedda are described in different ways. Most often it is said that the couple were good friends with Christina, and Christopher was like a great uncle to Hedda. Once upon a time, he even dated Christina herself, Hedda's mom, and they even lived all together. But the couple apparently broke up quickly. Nevertheless, their relationship remained quite warm. And Hedda, Christopher, and Dana simply invited her home as a nanny and paid her some sort of minimum wage. There wasn't much money in the Coulorn household, and Hedda already wanted to buy herself something. Dana Madden told me later that she and Hedda were friends and liked to go to the Dollar Tree store together, where they could get things cheap. On Thursday, July 14th, 1999, Hedda was already visiting Christopher and Dana at the Richmond Height house on Yale Avenue. There she was to look after their 2-month-old baby girl for at least a week, if not 2, and so for several days she lived there and cared for the baby and helped the young parents. Hedda herself was on summer vacation at the time. She was glad that at last she would be able to earn money on her own. The house where Christopher and Dana lived was an apartment building. At the same time, it was one story with a small garden. Besides them, 6 other families lived here, and Hedda's house was only 20 minutes away from Christopher's, so her mother could visit Hedda at any time. She gave her daughter a week's worth of medicine to take with her. As a reminder, the girl needed to keep a close eye on her blood glucose levels, and her mother called her regularly to remind her to take this medicine and to monitor her blood glucose. On July 14th, the mother of a newborn child, Dana, went to work. She worked at a convenience store at the cashier's gas station, and she didn't drive there in her own car. Someone dropped her off, either Christopher or one of her friends. Christopher himself claimed to have left the house around 11:30, and Dana went to work at 10:00. Where Christopher went is not entirely clear. Either he decided to give someone a ride somewhere, or he just left to go to a friend's house. Either way, Hedda stayed home alone with the baby. Toward morning, Christopher came home. It was around 4 o'clock. Still from the street, approaching the house, he heard the pitiful crying of his newborn daughter. Christopher quickly entered the apartment and noticed that his baby was all alone, and Hedda, who was supposed to be watching the baby all night, was nowhere to be found. In fact, it's not entirely clear why Christopher left Hedda all alone with the baby. From what I understand, he wasn't supposed to go anywhere. They were all supposed to spend the night together. Well, at least without the mother, who has a night job, and Hedda was just supposed to be the backup, in case the baby woke up and she needed to change a diaper or feed her formula.
It's certainly not much of a job for a 12-year-old either.
Work for a
Usually
12-year-old.
bays are left with teenagers for an hour or two at the most, during the day or evening,
in the
but not at
afternoon or
night.
evening,
At
but
least
not at
you and I
night.
have discussed
At
this
least
once
that's
before
what
in
you
other
and I have
stories.
discussed in
And
other
I think
stories.
we've all seen it
And
in
I
the
think
movies.
we've all seen it
Should
in the
have actually
movies.
been watching.
And all night
She's
long,
the one
a
who
kid,
has to keep
a
an
kid
eye on
with
her
diabetes,
at night. I mean,
had
she
to
could
be
have a sugar
virtually
crash or a
vigilant.
spike.
She's got to keep an
but
eye on her at
we'll
night.
come back to that.
She could have a sugar
right
crash
now,
or spike.
let's move back to the
but we'll
morning
get
of
back to
July
that.
15th.
Right now,
It was
let's
still
move back
several
to the
hours
morning of
before
July
sunrise.
15th.
Christopher
It was still
grabbed his
several
daughter and
hours before
started calling
sunrise.
Dana, his
Christopher,
girlfriend.
grabbing his daughter,
They
set
continued
about calling
talking,
Dana,
and
his
upon
girlfriend.
entering the apartment,
The couple was having a
police
long and
realized
very
almost
heated discussion
immediately
about
that there was something
They may have
fishy
even
going
had a
on.
fight.
There was no
Then the
sign
woman
of
dialed
forced entry,
911.
but there were
It was
traces
5 in
of
the
blood
morning
in
when the
house,
police arrived
on
on
the
the
floor
scene.
and on the walls. It's not
And upon entering
specified
the
how much
apartment,
blood
the
there
police
was,
realized almost
but
immediately
experts
that there
have
was something
concluded
fishy
that a
going
man
on.
would not have
There were
died
no
from such a
signs of
loss
forced
blood.
entry.
and it
but
is
there were
unlikely
traces of
that he
blood
was
in the
killed
house,
in this apartment.
on the floor and on the walls.
We entered the apartment
It's not
and
specified
noticed
how
blood
much
on the
blood there
couch.
was,
There
but
was a small
experts have
towel
concluded
lying
that a
next to
man
it.
would not have
There
died
was
from
blood
such
on
a
it
loss of
too.
blood,
There
and was
blood on
unlikely
the
to have been
pillows
killed
hidden
in this
behind
apartment.
the trash can too.
Says former police officer Mike Brown, who was on the scene that day. The lab quickly determined that it was Heather's blood. All of Heather's personal belongings, including her medications, which she never went anywhere without, were left in the apartment. Nothing appeared to be missing from the house. True, some items in the house seemed to be out of place, but no further clues were found.
Hader, according to her own mother, had never said anything bad about Christopher's family or the house. Everything had always been fine. This wasn't the first time she'd babysat their child. When they left the house that night, she was in a good mood. The couple didn't even know who to suspect who had hurt her. They knew the neighbors. They interacted with them. Hader didn't clash with anyone, and neither did they. Her disappearance was a mystery.
The police thought from day one that Heather's disappearance might be a murder, but they didn't say so officially. They just said they had no suspects. Well, because there's no body. Although that's surprising too. They could have said they suspect everyone, and then everyone would be on alert. They couldn't say they only suspect Christopher, for example, or anyone in particular, other than Christopher. Because then people would think, okay, the police already know, they already have something on someone, and the fact that I saw something strange or noticed something strange or something else connected to someone else, I'm not gonna tell them. And so important evidence might just get overlooked. But to assume that the girl is no longer alive, it was enough that her insulin was left at home. That suggests that she didn't leave of her own accord. After all, for example, wanting to run away for whatever reason, she would have grabbed her life-saving medication anyway. And if someone wanted to hold Heather hostage for ransom, for example, they would be sure to take it with them as well. The girl needs 2 shots a day. And to get the ransom, of course, it is necessary that the girl remains alive and conscious. It's impossible to buy insulin in America, and without it, the girl would quickly fall into a coma.
Heather had diabetes and needed several insulin injections a day. When we noticed she didn't have it with her, we knew something terrible had happened. We knew she wouldn't have survived without it.
Says Mike Brown, the detective who investigated the Heather case. Just the next day, a witness came forward. At 2:00 a.m., Christopher and Dane's neighbor was walking his dog. Suddenly, he saw a man carrying a sleeping child without shoes, wrapped in a white blanket or plaid, out of that very apartment. That's a very good lead, but here's the problem. This neighbor was not a good witness for the police. The man had severe vision problems. He was on disability. He couldn't see very well without his glasses, and he didn't wear his glasses to walk his dog. So, anything he could see in court would have no weight. But still, what about the blanket? Christopher was eventually asked, "Did any blanket disappear from your house?" And Christopher answered, thinking that generally yes, they had a plaid, a light-colored floral plaid, that had disappeared. It was on Christopher and Dana's own bed, and the girl's shoes were left at home. So if she was indeed carried away asleep or unconscious or even dead from the house, she would have been wrapped up in this light-colored plaid and would have been shoeless. So, at least you and I can believe the witness. Already on July 16th, Heather's disappearance was being talked about as an incident that had not happened by chance. And what is more likely, she was stolen by a person who knew her well and whom she trusted. If it had been a stranger, Heather would probably have at least screamed. And the walls in that house are very thin. her scream in the silence of the night would certainly be heard, and kidnapping and sexualized violence are statistically most often committed by family members and close relatives or friends, so it was definitely someone she knew. They put up flyers all over St. Louis with Heda's picture on them, but no new witnesses came forward. The police continued their search. They searched the entire house, the family's apartment, and their neighbors, and what they found was truly frightening. There was a garage in the building. It was accessed by the owners of several apartments, and as it turned out, Christopher and a neighbor he knew named Mike Mason were making honey in that garage. The night that Heather disappeared, they were doing the same thing. Speaking of Christopher, if his wife was at work, what's his alibi? First, he said he went to some party at a friend's house. Then he said he was giving someone a ride. Anyway, he changed his story several times, apparently to avoid telling about this garage lab all at once. Then he claimed that he and his friend met on the banks of the Mississippi River at night. The river, of course, is not far there, but what to do there at night is not quite clear either, but it probably had something to do with their criminal activities. I mean, drug dealing. It was only in the end that he admitted that he had been making drugs with another friend in the garage all along. But he wasn't in the garage when Heda disappeared. He spent a full 6 hours searching friends and acquaintances for the necessary ingredients, and it's not clear exactly who he was with. Then his neighbor Michael Mason is mentioned, then some unnamed man, not connected to the apartment complex. And this Michael Mason, with whom he owned a garage together, was questioned. And during the search of the garage and the apartment, he suddenly told the police that his car chains were missing from the garage. And they would be convenient, he said, to tie them to Heather's body to drown him in the Mississippi River. Where he came up with such a clever solution is unknown. Maybe he saw it in a movie, or maybe he thought of it himself. Maybe he's done it several times before. But usually when cops hear something like that, they get a pretty clear picture in their heads. And Mason doesn't have an alibi. He was just at home and claimed he didn't see the girl that night.
Some of them were acting strange. They wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't give any statements. They ducked and tried to leave the scene. Of course, we didn't let them go anywhere.
Mike Brown recalled. Heda's mother didn't know about the clandestine lab, but some family friends said her daughter saw everything. Heda may have known what the adults were doing in the garage and what they were using. Nevertheless, Heda didn't stop visiting and babysitting their child. Christina, who got angry at Heda over a cigarette, probably would have stopped such visits if she had known what was going on in the apartment. On Reddit, in discussions of the case, locals have written more than once that they knew people who were using, but they did it completely discreetly. For a long time they successfully hid it. Even Heda might not have realized what was going on at first, much less her mother, who spent much less time with her family. And the equipment to produce the same meth as they write on Reddit might just be hidden in some dirty bucket under the sink if we're talking about a home lab. But according to some reports, the garage at Christopher and Dana's house was part of a larger criminal network of drug production and distribution that stretched across several U.S. states, for which 15 people would later be taken into custody at once. And almost immediately, when this lab was uncovered, the police began to speculate that maybe the girl had seen something she shouldn't have seen. And because of that, they decided to eliminate her. Heda's disappearance united all of St. Louis. Many owners of stores, cafes, and other places even decided to collect from the world on a thread and offer a reward for any information that will help to find the girl. They managed to raise $10,000, but no one ever responded. Then, in November of 1999, in the local church held a service in honor of Heda. Her mother claimed it wasn't a memorial service. She still hoped that her daughter would be found alive and asked all acquaintances and concerned people to pray for her. Meanwhile, the search for Hedda slowly continued. They searched for the girl in the river, but nothing was found. They found something on the shore, a white blanket. But according to Dana Madden, it wasn't the same blanket that went missing from their apartment. Was there any blood on it? We don't know. In the course of further questioning, another lead emerged. Christopher gave the police the names of the men he met that night. As you and I recall, one by the river, the other in the garage. In addition to that neighbor, Mason. The names of those men are being withheld, but here's the important thing. The man he was with in the garage that night was alone there for a while. Christopher, as we remember, went to get the ingredients for his brew at that time. And when Christopher came back, he had already left and closed the garage. His girlfriend had picked him up, and she was driving a red BMW. That night, this guy and his girlfriend, left Christopher a note. They wanted him to return what he'd stolen from them. Apparently it's about the same criminal business, or money. But what if they took the hater to get him to return the stolen goods faster? That was Christopher's own suggestion. And the cops, of course, decided to investigate this couple and their car. They found this car and studied it, examined it for traces of blood and other evidence. The guy was questioned. Everything was clear. Hayda's mother, Christina, believed the truth about her daughter's disappearance would be found out by Christopher and Dana, her now ex-friends. In April of 2,000 years ago, the woman stalked Dana outside her work and attacked her, screaming and swinging a baseball bat. She demanded that Dana confess what had happened to her daughter, but Dana only had time to call the police and Christina was arrested. Christina's explanation for what she did was this. Christopher was, in her opinion, the prime suspect. He knew the girl, she trusted him. The man himself was confused in his testimony and changed his story. That's what led her to attack her ex-girlfriend. So what could have happened there? For example, Hayda's blood sugar could have plummeted and she went into a diabetic coma, and Christopher thought she was dead and panicked. Or Hayda could have fainted badly and hit her head and actually died. And Christopher, afraid his garage lab would be discovered, decided to hide her body somewhere. The presence of traces of blood suggests that some violence did occur there, but it would certainly be interesting to get a forensic expert's opinion. As to why? The blood on the walls and the floor, what might have been going on there? Well, and of course we can't speculate like that, because we don't know how many milliliters there were, and it was smeared or splattered and so on. But still, of course, yes, this is the information that's missing, and it would be interesting to know. Another point that is not very clear here, but, in principle, some conclusions could be drawn from it as well. Here is this laboratory in his garage. Is it a new venture that he started after the birth of his child to make money? Or is it an old business that he's been running for a long time? Because when he got home, he probably called his girlfriend just to coordinate with her, whether to call the cops. If he just opened his lab, he might not know how to hide it from the police. Well, he could have called his girlfriend simply because he really didn't know what was going on or what to do. The kid he'd left alone at home with some maybe man in the garage was suddenly gone. Donna Madden, interviewed by reporters several years after Hedda's disappearance, said she opens the news every month hoping to wait for updates on the Hedda case. She either feels responsible that it happened on her property or is simply afraid that her and Christopher's possible conspiracy will be exposed. So what about the suspects? All this time, interestingly enough, the cops have had suspects, one of whom, his name, though, is withheld, even failed a polygraph examination. However, as you and I, again, know from other stories, a polygraph is not enough for a trial. Well, it is also possible to fail it for various reasons. But what we do know is that this man has been in jail more than once before on other charges. And Christopher Hebert himself has done time, apparently for drugs. But there's a catch. If we imagine such a situation, the suspects are this one, and Christopher and his friend Mason, for example, and other suspects who may not be the main ones in this story, but still, if they have all been in prison, why did not any of them confess and tell the truth? I mean, if there were several of them, they could have colluded. One said to another, "Listen, tell me you were with me." Another said, "You cover for me." A third said, "You know I attacked her there. Can you do something to help me get rid of her?" And they somehow colluded. Then when they were interrogated and realized that they were facing time for drugs, for example, they would have tried any way they could to reduce their sentence. To get their sentences reduced. This is a fairly common practice. I'll tell you what I know about an unsolved crime, and you'll give me a shorter sentence, but that didn't happen. But they didn't find anything else. No remains, no girls' clothes. Any human remains found in St. Louis County are tested. There have been several such gruesome finds in the last 20-odd years. In March of 2002, a child's bones and clothing were found in a creek in St. Louis. But Hader's mother was able to tell from the clothes that it wasn't her daughter. Then DNA testing showed it wasn't Hader. There was an uproar, and a month later the police made an official statement. They said they knew who killed Hader, but they needed more time and more evidence. They did this to bring even more attention to the case, in hopes that the guilty party would crack.
I'm insanely frustrated that we haven't solved this case. We looked into every lead, every piece of evidence we could find. I recently woke up in the middle of the night and started thinking about one more piece of evidence. Evidence that maybe should have been handled differently. Any detective dealing with a case like this doesn't stop thinking about it until it's solved.
This is Detective Brown speaking. FBI officers were also involved in the case. They conducted their own investigation, but their findings matched those of the local police. Still, should we suspect Christopher? His alibi includes 2 unnamed friends at once. Each of them was spoken to. So, what? They both confirmed they were with him at the time. Then their word isn't enough. He could have put them up to it. But on the other hand, it might not have been Christopher at all, but one of his friends. They had already seen the girl and knew that she would be out at night, most likely alone at home. One or more of these friends of Christopher's could have attacked her and then, grabbing the first plaid they could find, run away and dispose of the body. But that's just speculation for now. Christina Coulon died in the year 2017, aged only 52. Her death notice lists Hader as her still-living daughter, so her mother never gave up hope that Hader might come home. But she never did. Will we ever know the answer to where little Hader disappeared to? Today the DNA from the crime scene is being retested, and as we know, technology has advanced in the meantime. And the case also hinges on those witnesses. Well, more specifically, possible accomplices. It's bad enough if one of them blabs, they'll find Hader. You and I have seen accomplices to crimes split up 20 or 30 years later. How one little piece of evidence solves cases that seemed unsolvable in the first place. That's the story, folks. Write what you think of this case and who do you think should have been looked at? The cops? I think a few people who were acquaintances of Christopher did it. He may even know who it is and he knows what happened. Well, write your opinion in the comments. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I'll be saying goodbye. Good night, everybody, and bye.
Before Christmas, the girl went to her bedroom and disappeared without a trace in the middle of the night. The case immediately attracted enormous attention, and more than 3,000 people came out to search for her. Meanwhile, detectives found out some shocking facts, which eventually led them to the unraveling of this high-profile story. Friends, after watching, I recommend you to check out my Telegram channel, where I publish for you daily interesting crime news from around the world without censorship. The link is in the description. Sarah Foxwell was born in the American city of Salisbury, Maryland. She grew up in a very large family. The girl had 2 sisters and 4 brothers. In addition, her mother had 3 more children from a previous marriage. However, Sarah's parents separated, causing her mother to experience serious hardship. Not only did she have to provide for all the children alone, but she also had to look after them. She had to work hard, so the children were often left to live with relatives. Sarah was the middle child and the most positive among the other children. When her brothers and sisters quarreled, she tried her best to reconcile them, and most often the girl succeeded. In December of the 2009 year, when Sarah was 11, she and the other children moved to her aunt and grandparents for a while. Christmas was coming up, and her mom was working harder than usual. She wanted to buy presents for each child, so she took extra shifts. Aunt Sarah lived on the outskirts of Salisbury in a big farmhouse. The children loved the place. The house was on a large property, so there was almost limitless space for them. December 22nd was a very ordinary day. Christmas was only 3 days away, and the children were in high spirits. They were running around the house, playing and having fun. Their aunt ordered them pizza for dinner, and at about 9 o'clock in the evening, they started getting ready for bed. Sarah slept in the same room as her 6-year-old sister Emma. It was at the very end of the hallway, near the back door. The girls chatted for a while longer and fell asleep. The next morning, Sarah's grandfather woke up and went to wake the children. He went into Sarah and Emma's room, but found only the younger girl there. The man thought that Sarah had already woken up. However, she was nowhere in the house. He told her aunt, and together they started looking for the girl, looking in every corner. When she realized that Sarah was not at home, her aunt thought that the girl might have gone outside to play with the snow that had fallen overnight. But the woman quickly realized that her shoes and jacket were at home. Soon the aunt noticed one very strange thing. She looked into the bathroom and discovered that Sarah's toothbrush was missing from its usual place. After she and her grandfather checked the area around the house and didn't find Sarah there, the aunt decided to call her mother. The woman immediately came to them and they contacted the police. Officers arrived on the scene and first began to look around the house on their own. Sarah's aunt said that every day before she went to bed, she checked to make sure all the doors and windows were locked, and last night she made sure they were as well. Police officers looked all over the place, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. Given that the girl's toothbrush was missing from the house, they immediately began to consider a possible kidnapping. They soon found further confirmation of this theory. The officers double-checked whether all the windows and doors in the house were indeed closed. When the police went to the back door, next to which was Sarah's room, and pulled the handle, it opened. The girl's aunt assured them that that door had been locked the previous night, and it hadn't been opened since. However, she quickly remembered that they kept a spare key in front of the door on the street side. The woman immediately went to check if it was there, and to her horror, she discovered that the key was not there. This only reinforced the theory of a kidnapping. Given that the perpetrator knew the location of the key, he must have been well acquainted with her family. There was another fact in favor of that. Their dog didn't make a sound that night, although he always barked at strangers. Based on all this, the investigators immediately began a large-scale search for the girl. news of Sarah's disappearance instantly spread through the neighborhood, and many people expressed their desire to help the police. The sheriff reached out to them through the media, asking them to check their neighborhoods for anything suspicious. In addition, dozens of police officers instantly got involved. In addition to the fact that all members of the local police station were not at work, colleagues from neighboring cities and even states came to their aid. All of them hoped that the girl could be found alive. Given that the perpetrator had apparently taken her toothbrush, he might have planned to hold her somewhere, so the police threw all their energies into the search. In front of the house, the first clue awaited them. They noticed relatively fresh tire tracks in the snow and assumed that this was the vehicle the kidnapper had come in. All of Sarah's warm clothes were left in the house, so the perpetrator obviously could not have taken her away on foot. Meanwhile, Sarah's relatives were brought to the police station, and there something unexpected happened. The missing girl's 6-year-old sister, who was sleeping in the same room with her, pulled her grandmother by the sleeve and whispered that she had a secret. She had seen the man who had taken Sarah. According to the girl, she woke up to the man saying something to her sister. Emma did not understand what was happening, but she became scared, so the girl pretended to be asleep. A while later, she saw that the man had left the room with Sarah. This story shocked her relatives, but next they were in for an even bigger shock. Emma said that she recognized the man. It was Mr. Tommy. The adults immediately realized who they were talking about. It was 30-year-old Thomas Lex, Aunt Sarah's ex-boyfriend. They'd broken up a few months ago, but until then the man had spent time at her house, and all the kids knew him well. But the police knew Thomas even better, as he had an impressive criminal history. Over the years, he had been on their radar for crimes involving the abuse of women and girls. The first time he went to jail was when he was 18 years old. At that time, Thomas abused a 12-year-old girl and received 4 years in prison, but was released after just a few months early. The man was later sentenced to 7 years in prison for abusing another minor, but for some reason, he was again released early after only 6 months in prison for good behavior, and was on the outside. Shortly thereafter, he received another 6 months for abusing another girl. He also attempted to assault another girl on the very day his wife came home with his newborn daughter from the hospital. That wife later divorced him and obtained a restraining order against Thomas because he had threatened to kill her and their daughter. Another incident occurred after a woman and her young daughter moved into the same street with him. The girl and her friend were sitting on the porch of her house, and at one point Thomas approached them. He told one of them that he had been watching her play in the yard and called her a wild girl. He then grabbed a branch and started hitting her on the buttocks. The girl ran home and told her mom what had happened. The woman spotted Thomas through the window and realized she had seen his face before. Before moving in, she went to the rapist registry registered in her new neighborhood, and Thomas's picture was there. The mother went to the police and the case went to court. However, Thomas managed to get away with it. Before the trial began, the woman was asked not to mention the fact that Thomas was on the rapist register and had previously been tried for abuse. The reason for this request was the concern that the trial would then be biased and Thomas might receive an unfair sentence. Just a few months before Sarah's disappearance, Thomas was again on the police's radar. He had snuck into the 24-year-old woman's bedroom in the middle of the night, stripped, and began satisfying himself while standing next to her bed. The man was arrested, but he posted bail and was released pending trial. Thomas successfully hid his criminal history from Aunt Sarah, but one day she found out about his crimes anyway. Yet the man somehow managed to convince her that the allegations were false, and that he hadn't actually done any of the things they accused him of. Given all of the above, Detectives had no doubt that Thomas was the one behind Sarah's abduction. Her relatives also noted that back in the days when the man had been dating her aunt, he had paid considerably more attention to Sarah. At the time, no one paid much attention to it, but after the girl's disappearance, this fact seemed quite disturbing. The police immediately went to Thomas's house to question him. The man lived only a few kilometers away, in a shed on the property of his parents. Investigators took him in for questioning and then obtained a search warrant for the shed. It was a mess and terrible living conditions, but no evidence was found linking it to Sarah's disappearance. However, the police found a huge number of magazines and DVDs with intimate content. The shed was literally littered with them. When questioned, Thomas immediately began to deny his involvement in Sarah's disappearance. He stated that he was trying to cope with his problems, referring to the urge to commit crimes against girls. According to Thomas, during the times when he was dating Sarah's aunt, he deliberately did not stay alone with the children so that no one could falsely accuse him of anything inappropriate. When he was told that Emma had seen him the night of the kidnapping, Thomas claimed that the girl had often made up stories before. The detectives didn't believe a word he said, and it wasn't just Thomas's criminal record. When talking about the disappearance of 11-year-old Sarah, he smiled and mocked. The sheriff thought at the time that Thomas thought his crime was perfect, and the cops wouldn't be able to prove his guilt. Nevertheless, the man claimed to have an undeniable alibi. That night, he was allegedly at the bar with his friend until well into the night. Investigators immediately checked this information, and to their surprise, this alibi was confirmed. Thomas had indeed been seen at the bar, but there was a catch. He left there at about 1 a.m., and since then, no one, including his parents, saw the man until 7 in the morning. Remarkably, while examining his phone, they discovered that Thomas had texted several women he knew that night and asked them to meet up, but they all declined. Nevertheless, detectives were never able to crack Thomas. They hoped the girl was still alive, so they threw all their energies into searching for her. Upon seizing the suspect's pickup truck, police officers immediately discovered some serious clues. Inside the vehicle was Sarah's very green toothbrush, as well as a large lollipop. Investigators allowed that Thomas could have used the candy to lure the girl into the car. In addition, the tire tracks of the pickup truck completely matched the tracks left in the snow in front of the house on the night of Sarah's disappearance. The man himself had told detectives that he hadn't been to the house in over a month, and now they had confirmation of the falsity of his words. With the suspect continuing to deny everything, the police were left with the hope of finding Sarah on their own. Several hundred officers and volunteers began searching the area, scouring the area within a kilometer radius of her home. They checked abandoned buildings, forests, ravines, and bodies of water. Kinologists with search dogs tried to catch the girl's trail, and from the air, the territory was inspected by helicopters. From the very first day, the case received a tremendous response from the locals. They came to the police station and signed up to volunteer, despite the bad weather and the approaching holidays. Unfortunately, that day's search never yielded any results. But the police officers didn't think of giving up and went out to look for her again with the first rays of the next day's sun. Throughout this time, the flow of concerned locals did not just not dwindle, but only increased. A total of 3,000 people joined the search. The sheriff even had to move the headquarters to the territory of a large baseball stadium, because the police station simply could not accommodate such a large number of people. It is noteworthy that among the volunteers were not only adults, but also their children. They distributed water, hot tea, and food to the people. Everyone tried to do their part, hoping that it would eventually help them find Sarah alive. Meanwhile, investigators had obtained the first piece of unequivocal evidence that linked Thomas to the kidnapping. Once the man was brought to the station, he was given a new set of clothes and his own was turned over to the lab. The experts found third-party DNA on the suspect's underwear and matched it with a sample of Sarah's that they got from the girl's belongings. The results showed a complete match. Given the location where the DNA was found, detectives came to a disappointing conclusion. In all likelihood, Thomas had abused Sarah after the abduction. The second day of the search also yielded no results. And on the morning of December 25th and Christmas Day, thousands of people once again took to the streets. Despite the holiday, none of them even thought of leaving the case. That same day, investigators received the location of Thomas's cell phone. Unfortunately, it was not an exact geolocation, but only information about his phone's connection to cell towers. Police found that he was connecting to 3 towers on the night of Sarah's disappearance, so they were able to determine the approximate area where the man was supposed to be. Investigators concentrated all their efforts in this area, which was practically on the border of the state, about 14 kilometers from Sarah's aunt's house. It was mostly woods and numerous narrow paths. Hundreds of people scoured every meter of this area, hoping that they would get a Christmas miracle and Sarah would turn out to be alive. But unfortunately, the reality was much sadder. At about 4 in the afternoon, police officers spotted the girl's body on the ground almost at the very border of the state. She was lying on her back and her arms were twisted so that she was left raised up and pointing to the sky. When medical examiners began examining the body, they were in for an unspeakable shock. First, they confirmed that the girl had been abused. Secondly, they found signs of strangulation, but determined that the perpetrator had failed to kill her that way. Experts found dirt in the victim's lungs and concluded that she had been tried to drown in a puddle. Apparently, the victim lost consciousness at this time. She suffered severe burns afterward. According to investigators, the perpetrator left her lying in those woods for a while, went to get a can of gasoline and set Sarah on fire. Traces of smoke were found in her lungs that would indicate that she was still alive at that point. It also explained why the deceased's hands were raised and pointing to the sky. This kind of thing sometimes happens when a person is exposed to fire. Such extreme brutality shocked everyone involved in the case. Even the detectives found it hard to believe that all these atrocities had really been done to the girl. However, now that they knew what had happened to Sarah, they all wanted only one thing: to get the death penalty for Thomas. Although he still refused to admit guilt, there was an impressive amount of evidence against him. Already after the discovery of the body, the forensic experts who examined his pickup truck in more detail found some of Sarah's hair and pieces of fabric from her pajamas in the front seat, which also proved Thomas's involvement in the kidnapping. Together with all the other evidence, it made it virtually impossible for him to get away with it. The trial had been pending for more than a year. However, it never began. At the beginning of 2011, the prosecution decided to offer Thomas a deal in which he would plead guilty and receive a life sentence instead of execution. Considering what he had done to Sarah, this deal might seem unfair. However, there were some very strong arguments in favor of this decision. Chief among them was that the victim's younger sister would have to appear at the trial in the presence of the murderer and testify multiple times. The kidnapping and death of her sister was a serious test for her psyche, and the trial could affect the girl even more. Another reason to offer a deal was that the prosecution could not be 100% sure of a death sentence. If Thomas's lawyers had secured a different sentence, the man might have had the opportunity to get out early, and the terms of the deal did not imply such an option under any circumstances. In addition, the state's governor was opposed to the death penalty at the time, which also reduced the chances of that sentence being imposed. In the end, Thomas agreed and told the detectives everything they already knew without him. The man admitted that he tricked the girl into leaving the house with them, then drove her far away, abused, and killed her. He ended up receiving 2 life sentences with no chance of getting out, and was transferred to a maximum security prison. In the first few days, One of the inmates attacked him with a shiv during lunch, inflicting several serious cuts on Thomas. He survived, however, and the prison staff took extra measures to protect the criminal from other inmates who dreamed of getting to him. Sarah's case caused a serious wave of outrage, as the system time after time allowed Thomas to get out and continue committing crimes. The state of Maryland eventually passed Sarah's law, which requires anyone convicted of child abuse to sit in prison for a minimum of 15 years before they have a chance to go free. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to give it a like if you like this video. I also recommend subscribing to our Telegram channel, where we publish daily the most interesting crime news from around the world without censorship. Thank you for watching.
Lori and Larry met when they both had a couple of failed marriages and several children behind them. But they were able to bring a wonderful feeling with them over the years. And on the morning of February the 10th, before Valentine's Day, they had a romantic date that cost one of them his life. Larry and Lori Eisenberg had just returned from Florida to Idaho, where the man had crossed a few items off his bucket list. He wanted to watch the shuttle launch, ride in a fan boat, and learn to sail. In the cold mornings of February 13th, 2018, Larry, 68, and his wife Lori, 64, woke up early to watch the sunrise. They took their motorboat out into the calm waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, to enjoy the first rays of sunshine at a picturesque spot called Sam Bay, before heading to an exclusive resort for breakfast. Unfortunately, these wishes could not come true. Just a few hours later, at 10:25, the Costanay County Sheriff's Office received an alarm call. The woman's voice broke into a scream. She choked with sobs. But when she calmed down a bit, she was able to explain to the 911 dispatcher what had happened. Larry and Lori Eisenberg had been together for 17 years. They each had several children from previous relationships, but still, they never argued, and were always looking for a reason to praise each other. Relatives and friends spoke of them as a wonderful couple who could carry their love through the years. On the eve of Valentine's Day, the man was in a romantic mood. He considered every day to be the best day of his life. He always appeared everywhere with a smile on his face. That morning, Larry sent a photo of the sunrise to his daughter before he left, and texted a friend that the fishing trip was canceled because he was feeling a little under the weather. The Eisenberg couple boarded the boat. Larry started the engine and the boat carried them gently rocking on the water towards the sun. They were already quite far from the shore when the engine suddenly stopped. The man went to the bow of the boat to see what had happened to the engine. Suddenly Larry got dizzy and fell overboard into the freezing water. Lori, who hadn't expected anything like this, became agitated and rushed to his aid. But she stumbled, fell and hit her head on the heater. Blood began to flow from her nose. When she got up, her husband was nowhere to be found. He had apparently disappeared into the dark water. Attempts to find the cell phone were unsuccessful. Then Lori tried to start the engine, but when Larry crashed, he apparently broke the ignition switch and had to start the engine manually. The distraught wife circled the spot where her husband had fallen into the water. As she gazed into the mirror surface of the lake, desperately trying to find him, she was afraid to swim any further or return to shore lest she lose her bearings. She even pressed the boat horn several times to get someone's attention. When Lori realized that everything was useless, she felt cold all over her body. She pulled out the blanket and saw her husband's cell phone. By the time she called the emergency services, about 2 hours had passed since Larry disappeared into the freezing water. After the call, Lori lowered her hand hopelessly, and the phone slipped overboard. Shortly after 11 o'clock, officers deployed to the nearby shore and sent a rescue boat to bring the distraught woman ashore and provide medical care while the Eisenbergs' boat was towed for further investigation. And although at first glance it all looked like a tragic accident, the police had to make sure there was no evidence of foul play. Larry was probably dead after more than 2 hours in the water. Survival in such harsh conditions is almost impossible. The task now was to reproduce a detailed picture of the incident and verify the veracity of the woman's words. Upon entering the boat, investigators immediately noticed blood spatter in several places, presumably due to the woman's nosebleed, despite Laurie's statement that the ignition switch was faulty. Just before Larry went underwater, police found a switch, and the cord on the floor struck investigators as odd, because for the engine to start, the switch and belt must be attached to the ignition switch. In addition, the ignition key was clearly bent, indicating a possible struggle. The police also searched Laurie's bags. Several keys and an empty juice bottle were found in her handbags. All items were confiscated as evidence, and the boat was taken to a nearby parking lot for storage. The truck used by the Eisenbergs to tow the boat was also inspected. However, nothing of note was found there. One of the officers noticed Laurie's lost cell phone and a bottle of allergy medication on the center console. It was an over-the-counter medication. The search for Larry Eisenberg in the water was complicated by the fact that he was wearing dark clothing, and Laurie did not know exactly where the boat was when the man fell overboard. This significantly expanded the search area. Instead of a rescue diver, the decision was made to deploy an acoustic group. Search and rescue helicopters also flew over the lake in the hope of finding the drowned man's body, but to no avail. On the first day, the sonar rescue team spent 3.5 hours searching for Larry. Experts searched for the body in the cold waters of the lake until it became too dark to see anything. Meanwhile, one of the officers met with Laurie Eisenberg at the hospital where the woman was taken after the incident. He wanted to pinpoint a more specific search area, so he showed her a map of the lake and asked her to recount how Larry had fallen into the water and what exactly had happened to the boat's engine. Laurie said that after a walk around the lake, her husband started saying something about the resort they were going to. He had originally planned to go fishing in the morning, but in the morning his health took a turn for the worse, so they just decided to enjoy the morning and have breakfast at the resort. At that moment, the engine cut out, and Larry went to see what the problem was. Laurie herself stayed inside and watched through the glass to see what her husband was doing. Suddenly he turned around, went pale, and started to fall on his side. Apparently he was leaning on the key at the moment of the fall and it bent in the ignition. The woman thought something was wrong with his heart and rushed to his aid. If she hadn't tripped at the worst possible moment, Larry might still have been alive. Laurie covered her face with her hands and was silent for a while, only her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A few minutes later, she ran her finger over the map, but couldn't pinpoint the exact location of the tragedy. Her thoughts were confused, and she couldn't remember if there were trees or houses nearby, which side the sun was shining from. She even lost track of time as she searched for her husband in the water. In situations like this, a minute can seem like an eternity. Due to the great depth of the lake and the low water temperature, the search for the body was very difficult. First, the Sonoran team had to find the drowned person, and then, with the help of rescue divers, lift the body to the surface. As efforts to find Larry were still unsuccessful, investigators called on the Sonoran team to accompany the Sonoran group to the lake, but the woman's presence was only a nuisance. She still couldn't remember any specific landmarks. The lack of any information about whereabouts seemed odd to the investigators, but Eisenberg's behavior surprised them even more. During the search work, Larry joked, laughed irrelevantly, and then suddenly began sobbing as if remembering why she was invited to the lake. Too little time had passed after the death of a loved one, and Larry couldn't seem to come to terms with the idea that her husband was no longer alive. She now felt guilty for showing positive emotions. "Our paradise," That's what the Eisenberg couple called their home. After her husband's death, Larry could no longer stay in the house where he had lived happily for 17 years. When the wife returned from the lake that day, she began to take action. Larry and Laurie's residence was 20 minutes southwest of town. The woman invited her relatives to help move all the belongings and furniture out of the house because she wanted to sell it as soon as possible. Vigilant neighbors reported this to the police. It seemed to them that the woman was behaving strangely and suspiciously. Laurie Eisenberg was proud to have worked for the North Idaho Housing Coalition for many years, and only recently the chief accountant of this institution ordered an internal audit because he noticed some violations. Many employees suspected that something illegal was going on at the coalition, but when the truth came out, all employees were literally stunned. This shocking revelation piqued the interest of investigators and gave the investigation a whole new direction. Laurie Eisenberg was suspected of possible fraudulent activity. It involved the theft of coalition funds amounting to $500,000. The woman was suspended and threatened with dismissal. Everyone who knew her couldn't believe what was happening. Laurie had no criminal record. She and her husband were not poor. All these accusations seemed like some kind of monstrous mistake. Sensing that something was wrong, Larry's children asked permission to speak to the investigators about their concerns. They expressed concerns about going to the lake at this time of year. Also, their father was not going fishing because he was unwell. Then Dean, Larry's son, talked about Laurie's strange behavior in the last few days after her father's disappearance. She asked how they would divide the inheritance. Dean was very concerned about his father's death, so he just left without even discussing the subject. It seemed premature to him, as his father's body had still not been found. To somehow reassure the relatives of the deceased, the detective explained how the search was conducted. The sonar team first checked the area of maximum probability, but when this yielded no results, they scanned the water diagonally in different directions. After Larry's family left, the investigators went over all the details of the case again. And although Eisenberg's wife was not among the suspects, her behavior in general raised doubts. She was able to calmly answer all the investigators' questions and explain all the details. But something about the investigation was bothering the investigators. The next day, a search was carried out at the Eisenberg house in connection with Laurie's fraud allegations. And on the following February, the woman was arrested on 40 counts of forgery and 1 count of grand theft at the non-profit North Idaho Housing Coalition, where she had previously worked as executive director. Her bail was set at US, which was immediately posted by one of her daughters. But the startling discovery happened literally a day later. On March 1st, through 3 weeks later, after Larry Eisenberg suddenly plunged from his boat into the icy waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene, the body of a man was found floating face down near the shore, about 5 kilometers from the scene of his wife's reported accident. No suspicious injuries were found on the body, and based on the drowned man's clothing, it was likely that the search was ultimately successful. The body was pulled from the water and sent for further examination. An autopsy confirmed that it was Larry Eisenberg, but the coroner also found out the cause of death. It turned out that Larry did not die in the water, as no signs of drowning were found. Toxicology tests found lethal levels of an antihistamine in his body, which is used to fight allergies and suppress some cold symptoms. This drug works very quickly, but can only be fatal in rare cases if too much is taken in a short period of time. Larry's antihistamine dose exceeded the norm by a factor of 70. Therefore, according to the coroner, Eisenberg died before he fell into the water. Authorities decided not to immediately release the autopsy results. In an earlier statement to police, Laurie mentioned that her husband took a number of different pills each day, then forgot and took them again, often mixing up the dosages. It is possible that the wife was telling the absolute truth, but it is also possible that she gave this information in advance, in case the body was found, and a lethal dose of drugs was discovered in the body. Lori also insisted that Larry had not been entirely healthy recently, and had complained of feeling unwell, but all the other relatives unanimously asserted the opposite. The only time Eisenberg mentioned his illness was in a text message to a friend the morning before he disappeared, assuming he sent the text message himself. An experienced analyst determined that the last time Larry's phone was used near Lori's son's home was after Eisenberg's disappearance, although the woman claimed she threw the cell phone in the water immediately after calling emergency services. Lori could not explain how the phone could have been used after that. Her son from a previous marriage had also sworn, and swore, that he had never held Larry's cell phone in his hand. At the end of May, Lori did not appear at the hearing in the fraud case. As it turned out, the woman was trying to avoid punishment. Eisenberg quickly fled the area and was on the run for about 2 months before she surrendered to authorities in July. Detectives working on the case of Larry Eisenberg's mysterious death at the time questioned colleagues and acquaintances of the deceased. They learned that cracks were beginning to appear in the couple's ideal relationship. Although Lori and Larry seemed to be a happy couple, in recent months the man had often complained to his friends about his wife's excessive spending. He didn't like the fact that a large portion of their joint savings went to support Lori's children, who were long independent adults. Investigators also learned that Lori was a rather frivolous woman. She easily cheated on her first husband with 3 different men, including Eisenberg, and while this was in the past, it still didn't provide a particularly flattering description of Larry's wife. The issue of betrayal was also raised on the board of the Housing Coalition, but the next discovery could serve as a concrete motive for the crime. Investigators discovered changes to Larry's will that had been made by none other than Lori. The handwritten changes were made about a month before his death. According to the new will, it turned out that 80% of the inheritance did not go to his own children, but to 6 stepdaughters, Lori Eisenberg's daughters from another marriage. It is not known what the woman was counting on when she made these changes. Eventually, authorities released the autopsy results and called this case a full investigation into a particularly serious crime in which a person died. Investigators even spoke to Eisenberg's doctor, who said that Larry was perfectly healthy for his age. He was never prescribed a drug that later proved fatal. Based on all the evidence gathered, police believed that Lori had mixed an excessive dose of medication into the juice bottle. Larry drank the contents and fell overboard from the effects of the toxic drug not far from the shore where he was found. Lori immediately used a trolling motor to move the boat away from the area before calling 911. Neither spouse appeared to have life insurance, which is often a motive for such crimes. Investigators learned, however, that there was an agreement between the couple. If one of them died, the other would become the owner of the joint property. Lori intended to use the money to pay off the Housing Coalition. At the time of his death, Larry did not know that his wife was involved in fraud at her workplace, and she did it all to help her daughters financially. At least, that's what she told her children. 2 months later, in July of the same year, Lori was tired of hiding because she knew she would be found sooner or later anyway. She contacted the sheriff's office herself. She said she was simply living with her family in California. Earlier this year, Lori and her 4 daughters admitted to committing fraud involving the use of electronic communications and pleaded guilty to the charges. Lori Eisenberg was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and her daughters received 3 years probation and several hours of community service, as well as a fine of more than US dollars USD. While Lori was in prison for fraud, the investigation into her husband's strange death continued. investigators checked the search history on the woman's phone and found incriminating evidence. While Larry enjoyed their trip to Florida together, Lori studied depth charts and articles about drownings and boating accidents. Finally, in February of the year, while still in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement, Lori was indicted for the willful death of her husband, Larry Eisenberg. Lori, 67, appeared in court in May 2021 for sentencing. She denied to the end that the crime was planned and tried to portray everything as an accident, but the jury did not believe the woman, and Lori Eisenberg was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 30 years. Are the daughters of a selfish woman involved in the story of a man's death? Will forever remain a mystery.
Starved Rock National Park is very picturesque in the American state of Illinois. The park is located 144 kilometers west of Chicago on the rocky banks of the Illinois River. There was once a French fort and an Indian reservation here, but there are few reminders of their presence. There is only a small exposition in the tourist center and the park's name. Starved Rock is literally starved rock. The park got its name because of an indigenous legend. It says that in the 1760s, when the chief of the Ottawa tribe visited the tribal council in Illinois, he was killed. To avenge the chief's death, the tribe members, along with their allies, drove a band of Illinoisans to the top of a cliff and surrounded them. They were held there until all who were on top starved to death. Some of the warriors tried to escape in desperation, but they were killed in the surrounding woods. That's how the name of this rock and later the entire park came to be. But to think about the gloomy past of these places, modern visitors to the park do not want to think about it at all. It is popular all year round. Starved Rock is one of the most beautiful places in the state. The park has many trails, canyons, and waterfalls. From the cliff, there is a stunning view of the Illinois River. Time seems to flow differently here. But in 1,960 years, the peaceful atmosphere of Starved Rock Park and its surroundings became just a memory overnight. On March 17th, the bodies of 3 women were found in one of the canyons. The murder case of Mildred, Lillian, and Frances would be thoroughly investigated. But the controversy about what happened would continue even 60 years later. Why? Let's try to understand. Mildred Lindquist, Lillian Oetting, and Frances Murphy were 3 friends. They lived in an affluent suburb of Chicago, 5 minutes from each other. The women often attended the Presbyterian church together. At the time of the events, Mildred and Lillian were each 50 years old, and Frances celebrated her 47th on her birthday. Lillian was married to George Oetting. Together, they raised 3 children. Lillian's brother thought no person was more kind and charitable than his sister. Mildred was married to Robert Lindquist. They had 2 children. Mildred spent much time on the school board and took an active part in the lives of her and Robert's children. Everyone who knew the woman personally remarked that Mildred was a fantastic person. She always had a smile on her face and could handle any difficulty. Frances became the wife of lawyer Robert Murphy. Like her friends, she was on the school board. The couple had 4 children. The mother of many children spent her days caring for her children. But Frances also had a hobby. She loved growing roses. She had a talent for gardening. Her well-tended garden was the envy and admiration of her neighbors. Frances used her talent to help tidy up the gardens and flower beds of the city. Unfortunately, more detailed information about the heroines of this story could not be found. Everything happened in the 60th year, so it is impossible to cover the victims' biographies comprehensively. From the words of their relatives, it is known that they planned the trip to Stardock several months in advance. It was decided to leave the husbands at home. The women were going to spend 4 days in nature, the trip the friends were looking forward to. For each of them, it was to be a kind of reboot. Lillian Oetting had been caring for her husband all winter. Earlier, he had suffered a heart attack. She dreamed of spending a few days away from home. She wanted to change scenery, walk in the fresh spring air, listen to birdsong, and spend time with close friends. The women planned hiking and chose accessible routes, as one had back problems and a displaced spinal disc, so she couldn't go on long-distance hikes. On Monday, March 14, 1960, the women loaded their luggage into Frances's car and set off toward the park at about 10 in the morning. Mrs. Murphy parked her gray station wagon in the Stardock Lodge Hotel parking lot at about 12:20. The women then checked in at the front desk and were escorted to rooms 109 and 119. The friends dropped off their bags and returned to the front desk to get lunch coupons from the receptionist. The friends had a snack at the local dining room and walked. It was about 1 o'clock on the clock. Although the calendar spring had already started, the path in the park was covered with snow. The friends put on rubber galoshes and strolled through the park, slipping now and then. They stopped occasionally to take pictures. The women reached a dead end at St. Louis Canyon, where cliffs framed a majestic frozen waterfall. This spot is only 1.5 kilometers from the hotel. The canyon is a chasm about 45 meters deep with a single entrance. There are also dark caves in the canyon's depth, formed from frozen water from the glacier. They go about 4.5 meters deep. Lillian set up Frances's cameras and took a few pictures. Then, the women turned around. They were going to walk back. This is where it gets confusing. So much so that the only analogy I can think of is hair with gum in it. That image has popped up for me several times throughout this story, and I think you will soon understand why. Evening comes, and according to some reports, Lillian's husband, George Oting, tried to contact his wife. She promised to call him herself, but since she never did, George called first. The receptionist at the front desk said it was impossible to transfer the call to Lillian's room. No one was there. He assumed the ladies would return later and promised to tell Lillian her husband had called. Oting hung up and went to bed. According to other sources, none of the women had called their husbands on Monday evening, and they had not reached the hotel. This is very strange, though. Trom women coming alone to a hotel in the 60s was a pretty progressive decision. A woman was a sort of appendix to a man back then, so it's suspicious that no one wanted to contact them on the evening of the first day of their trip to find out about the experience and the weather, at least their children. The women, I recall, had 9 of them for 3. Had they not called their mothers? Apparently not. So, the second version is that it wasn't until Tuesday morning that George called the hotel and asked to be connected to his wife. The employee who answered the phone told the excited man that the 3 girlfriends had been seen at breakfast. They allegedly had a note in their logbook that the women had attended breakfast. Calmed by this response, Oting hung up the phone. And that night, a belated winter storm hit the Illinois River Valley. It was one of the coldest days of that season. About 6 inches of fresh snow fell in St. Louis Canyon. It covered all tracks. The blizzard continued through the night. The trails in the park became virtually impassable. On the morning of the 16th of March, Wednesday, about 7 o'clock, Frances Murphy's husband called at the hotel. He reported that his wife had come to Stardock as early as Monday with her friends, but nothing has been heard of her or her friends since then. Terry Martin, an employee of the hotel, promised to check the guest rooms. He sent 2 cleaners there. They inspected the rooms and told him that the women's beds were made and their belongings were not unpacked. That's the first theory. According to the second version, the beds are also untouched, but some belongings are neatly laid out in a locker. There are no formal documents, photographs, or affidavits about the writing of the rooms. There are no formal documents, photos, or affidavits about the writing of the rooms. Attorney Andy Hale, whose podcast I was listening to, also wondered about this, and I highly recommend it to you. And a fundamental question: why were the rooms only checked on Wednesday? So they weren't cleaned on Tuesday? And why didn't Mrs. Murphy's husband call until Wednesday? So he was okay with her not contacting him on Monday. She didn't get him on Tuesday. It wasn't until Wednesday morning that he decided he should have dialed. These are unanswered questions. In the meantime, hotel staffers continued their search for the women. They looked in the parking lot. Francis's car was still parked there. It was covered in snow, so they hadn't gone anywhere. That same Wednesday, the husbands contacted each other, and Terry Martin called the police. It was 8:20 in the morning on the clock. LaSalle County Sheriff Ray Uty arrived about 9:15 a.m., 45 minutes after Mr. Martin's call. He immediately began questioning the guests in the hotel's dining room. He hoped that someone had seen the missing woman. The hotel staff was also asked, but no one seemed to have seen the friends, and no one could even say when they were last seen. All right. But what about the breakfast on Tuesday, which is marked that they attended? Why didn't any of the guests see them then? Or why didn't anyone say they were seen sitting across from me? There's a bit of a strange theory about that. Perhaps the concerned husband was lied to by the hotel staff. This policy used to be at some hotels where people sometimes came to meet their lovers. So it was decided to the worried spouses not to reveal the truth that the woman, for example, did not spend the night at the hotel. Why would the hotel take on such a responsibility and get involved in someone else's marital twists and turns? So maybe they said, yes, mister, what's your name? Well, sure, yeah, she slept over. And they're like, okay, the woman's cheating. Or maybe the hotel logbook that marked breakfasts and dinners was just negligently entered and checked off randomly so that everybody showed up. And that was it because nobody needed it, and they didn't check really who was and who wasn't. Meanwhile, the search was in full swing. It was decided to check other hotels in the vicinity of the park. Suddenly, the woman decided to stay there due to some circumstances. The hospitals were also called, but no reassuring information could be found. The friends' husbands moved toward Star Rock Park, and the sheriff began organizing search parties. The police decided to involve the Boy Scouts, or the boys, who were sent to a children's reform camp. Henry Wolford was a camp officer of the Illinois Youth Commission. Henry arrived at the park with 5 young men at about 11 o'clock. Wolford had lived in these parts long enough to know the park and its surroundings well. As a camp staff member, Henry often worked in that park, including working with the children. They kept it clean. Terry Martin suggested that Henry and his boys tour St. Louis Canyon. This place was popular with tourists during the winter because of the frozen waterfall. The search party moved out there at about 12:30. Moving to the canyon on foot, the searchers closely scrutinized every meter of the path. At one point, the group faltered as if anticipating trouble. Around this time, local newspaper reporter Bill Denley was finishing up the last report of his shift for the afternoon newscast. When he received a report of the mysterious disappearance of 3 women, he grabbed his camera and headed down the snowy roads toward Stardrock Park. Denley was at the west entrance to the park when he noticed a boy running down an icy ravine toward the road. Bill pulled into the parking lot and saw several other young men. They were loudly discussing that they had found bodies in the cave. Denley recognized the boys as Boy Scouts from the Lenoir's Youth Commission's forest camp. The reporter himself had once worked there. The reporter took the boys aside to ask them a few questions, and the kids told him that in one of the canyon's caves, searchers had found, quote, horribly mutilated bodies. Bill Denley called his colleagues. Within minutes, the news traveled across the country. Bill Denley was one of the first journalists to enter St. Louis Canyon. He saw the bodies themselves. It was an extremely gruesome sight. 2 women were lying side by side on their backs with their legs spread wide apart. The third was 1.5 meters away from them. All of them had their clothing below the waist, either torn or missing. This suggested that the motive for the crime was sexualized violence. The whole scene was like a scene out of a horror movie. It only took one look at the bodies to realize that each had been struck dozens of times in the head. but their naked legs were bruised as well. Mrs. Murphy's pelvic area was also visibly bruised. Lillian and Mildred's wrists were bound, but not tightly. The rope had been cut. Mrs. Murphy's camera was found 3 feet away. Its leather case was covered with blood and the strap was torn. Also found at the scene was Frances's bloody binoculars. It had been broken into 2 pieces. One of the women's gloves had been ripped off her hand. The other woman's jacket was lying nearby. A pair of glasses, broken in blood, also lay near the bodies. But what was most frightening was that the whole scene seemed to be on display as if it carried some message. The bodies were lying on a dais. Someone had put them there on purpose. This wasn't an attack that could be easily explained. So what could it all mean? The entire canyon was covered with nearly 15 inches of snow. It was now to be carefully melted to expose any possible tracks. The ice had been melted with flamethrowers, which didn't seem like a good idea after a few years, considering that the fire could burn necessary evidence, like hair or tiny bits of fabric from clothing. Detectives arrived on the scene. They organized searches of the immediate area. The LaSalle County District Attorney, Harlan Warren, was personally involved. He also happened to come across a frozen branch with traces of blood near the crime scene. There was also blood under that branch. He looked at this find and decided that this branch was the weapon. It was taken into evidence and described in detail. The branch was almost a meter long, 10 centimeters in diameter, and weighed 4.5 kilograms. The results of the inspection of the canyon and its surroundings led detectives to the idea that the women could have been attacked outside the cave, and only then were the bodies dragged there. By the way, the entrance to the cave is 1.5 meters above the ground, and the women were not straight inches. That is, ordinary women 40 to 50 years old. The crime scene was fenced off with a special tape, and the bodies were not moved until forensic experts and representatives of the state crime laboratory arrived. The experts worked in the canyon until late into the night. Lillian's loved ones, Frances and Mildred, hoped the women would be found alive to the last. Mr. Lindquist, upon learning of his wife's disappearance, was in such a hurry to join the search that he forgot to lock the front door at home. Neighbors noticed this and called the police. But when he arrived at the canyon, he was told the terrible news. The canyon women were taken to a funeral home for a thorough examination and cover-up. The exact date and time of death was difficult to determine, all because of the cold. As we recall, unprecedented snowfall hit that area after their disappearance, and temperatures stayed negative. However, experts have suggested that the women were attacked on the day they arrived, in the afternoon. Multiple blows with a heavy blunt object caused death. Specifically, over 120 blows were inflicted with different objects. Some of the blows left semicircular marks. Some of the weapons were sharp-edged. Photos of the scene are online, and if you're interested, you can find them. But just so you understand the force with which the blows were delivered, I will say that the women were unrecognizable, in fact, without faces, without eyes, so whoever did this dry and clean couldn't get away with it. There would have been marks on him, too, because the face has a lot of tiny capillaries, and the splashes would have been everywhere. As for the weapon, detectives concluded that a camera and binoculars were probably used, and there's that stick since they found remnants of wood chips in one of the women's skulls. Anyway, it was minimal, just wood splinter residue. It's not like there's a whole huge chunk of wood. But you and I will touch on all of that. The same cold and lack of technology prevented us from finding evidence of rape. So from the unsub's point of view, there was no rape. There was just no trace of semen. Damage is just hard to document. And indeed, after they'd been lying in such a cold, open area for days, it would be next to impossible. And the question remains open. Mainly, there are times when there is no damage at all. But we do remember that Mrs. Murphy had bruising in the groin area. There were bloody, smeared fingerprints on the combination worn by one of the women and on the pair of stockings and belt. Their location led to the conclusion that they belonged to the assailant or assailant. What's more interesting is that in the photos, it can be discerned that the two women were wearing scarves. During the autopsy, it's true that it looks like they switched scarves. The subject experts also indicated that one of the women was wearing sweatpants, but that was not the case. So either the examination was poorly done, the clothes were mixed up, or the women changed clothes and switched things. The whole neighborhood was, as they call it, on its ear. People were afraid to go out on the streets and canceled trips to Starved Rock, which is understandable and expected. The police were under incredible pressure. They needed to solve this case as soon as possible, and they, in principle, would have been happy to, except no one had any experience. None of the assigned detectives had ever handled a case this serious before. This was their first big case. The first place they looked for the suspect was the hotel. On the day the women disappeared, there were 26 guests and 46 employees at the Starved Rock Lodge. In all, 62 people worked there. They were all interrogated, and even polygraph tests were conducted. There was a reward for any information that would help arrest the perpetrator. $30,000. And at the time, that was a lot of money. You could buy 2 houses with that money. Authorities announced their intention to interview all LaSalle County criminals because the motive of abusing women has not been discounted despite forensic evidence. The version considered was that someone driving by the park in a car saw the 3 women parked, followed them on foot, and attacked them. According to another version, the perpetrator lurked in the park, waiting for victims. Authorities even told reporters that they have evidence of the latter version. What made the case particularly intriguing? They developed photos from Francis's camera. And photos in cases like this, especially if the victims took those photos, it's just a separate kind of cold sweat running down your back, you know, and goosebumps. Just imagine if you managed to take a picture of the attacker. It's hard to explain, but I remember the Listen Fron case and, what was the other girl's name? Panama, anyway. And there were some bizarre pictures there, too. And it's just chilling to this day what those pictures meant. Why they took them. Whether they were trying to scare them off, or whether they were trying to take photos to investigate who was hiding in the bushes and attacking them. So, it's not so simple here in this case either. There are 4 photos in total. And in one, the creepiest of them all, the 2 friends, Francis and Mildred, are standing in front of the cave. And behind the trees, a silhouette is clearly visible in the background. Also, it looks like it's holding something heavy and significant in its hand, with the stranger's other hand clasped against its body. Detectives even attempted to put together a portrait of the man. He looks about 30 years old. His height is close to 182 centimeters, and his weight is about 72 kilograms. But to be fair, some were not interested in this find. Perhaps it is an illusion accidentally created by the double exposure. Does it give any clue? No. Does it look creepy? Yes. Meanwhile, the search for the perpetrator or perpetrators continued. At the beginning of the investigation, it was decided to put up roadblocks all along Highway 178 and near Highway 71. They passed near the park. Every car was stopped. The police hoped that they could find witnesses rather than suspects this way. In case someone saw something suspicious, a group of people stopped for some reason near the park that day. Police also assessed the appearance of drivers and passengers, see if they had fresh scratches or bruises on their faces. They were also looking for a suspect among the poachers. The reasoning was as follows. They often carry ropes and pickaxes. Plus, a week after the murders, several articles were published in which authorities described a fierce crackdown on illegal hunters over the winter. Detectives speculated that maybe the unfortunate women had seen something they shouldn't have and were dealt with for it. But that theory was never confirmed. There were specific suspects. Thus, under the scrutiny of the police was a particular groom who worked in a stable near the canyon. The cops went to talk to him. Maybe he had seen or heard something suspicious that day. The stableman was acting very strangely. He seemed agitated. His clothes were unkempt. Then he was brought in for closer questioning, but the stable boy disappeared. And there's no information about what finally happened to him or where he is. So, detectives went to a psychiatrist for a profile of the killer. He said they were looking for a sadistic sex maniac. He probably acted alone. According to the psychiatrist, he might commit a similar crime if not found. Meanwhile, a month passed. On the 21st of March, a man from LaSalle said he was driving along the highway at about 14:0 on the day of the attack. He witnessed a scene in the stable that seemed very strange to him after the news of the attack. The man saw a brown-beige car pull up to the three women in the parking lot. Out of it stepped a young red-haired guy looking about 25 years old, of average height. He wore a yellow jacket, blue pants, jeans, or slacks. The young man started talking to the women. Another male passenger was sitting in the car at the time. Later, though, this witness said he saw a gray car, not a brown and beige car. Later articles indicated that he drove through the area not at 14:00 but at 16:00. Anyway, the testimony, either he changed it, or somehow it was twisted, or he mixed up something. It's not clear either. Then, on March 26th, the police received intriguing new information. Two women and a 12-year-old girl had been walking in Matheson State Park on March 12th, 2 days before the attack on the three friends. This park is adjacent to Sarfed Rock Park. The women said that while they were walking, they were approached by a guy with a camera. He tried to start a conversation with them and take them deep into the park, but the women were able to get away from the strange, rusty-haired young man. According to the witnesses, he looked to be about 25 years old. His height and other parameters matched the description given to the suspect by the other man who saw the parked car. While the police were trying to identify this wry-haired guy, another thorough search was conducted in the canyon and the surrounding area. Even water was pumped out in St. Louis, hoping to find more evidence. The search turned up red fibers of cloth near the cave. Similar fibers had been found earlier on clothing and bodies, though neither woman wore anything red, so that could also be evidence. But despite active police action, the investigation has been deadlocked almost from the start. There were few real clues and evidence, and the theories about what had happened became more and more insane as time went on. The investigation gradually came to a standstill due to bureaucratic delays. The fact is that County Attorney Harlan Warren, a hard-working and respected official, was technically in charge of investigating the case. However, the Illinois State Police retained their authority in the case because everything happened on park property, which was, appropriately, under their jurisdiction. And Warren found himself in a desperate situation. He was forced to cooperate with state authorities because the police around Golisol had no experience solving such crimes. Time passed. The investigation was not progressing, and doors that no one had ever locked before were now chafed shut. Hardware stores couldn't handle the influx of customers, and specialty stores and guns began to disappear from sale quickly. The Starfrog Lodge Hotel, where the women were staying, was deserted. Some motorists were willing to take roundabouts to avoid passing Starfrog Park. This put pressure on the police officers, especially at the Harlan Warren County office. They were being pressured to make some progress. And there was pressure from within, too, because the election for a new prosecutor was looming, and money was another problem. The cost of the investigation was skyrocketing. A hotel owner named Spyrus and his son volunteered to be fingerprinted. Maybe he wanted to demonstrate that he was an upstanding citizen and set an example for others. Or maybe he just wanted to get his family off his back as soon as possible to restore the tourist flow. The hotel owner also donated $5,000 for further fingerprinting work because an entire department had been set aside. Both he and his son, George Spyrus, passed the polygraph test. In one of the interviews with the police, George was wearing a red plaid jacket. As it turned out, several things in his closet were red, which alerted the police, and they were taken for analysis. But, as Andy Hale said, he didn't provide the police with all the items. Some sweatshirt, as he put it, was either in the wash or lost somewhere. Well, not everything was examined, and the fibers from none of his clothes matched the evidence found at the scene. While fingerprint checks and interrogations were going on, Warren made another desperate attempt to solve the case. He realized he needed helpers to succeed in the investigation. So, instead of choosing someone from his staff, he enlisted 2 county detectives who became solely answerable to him. Their names were Bill Dammit and Wayne Hass. They were, in his opinion, trustworthy and intelligent. The detectives would not reveal details of their investigations to reporters, who were already kicking cops around looking for a scoop. This was the parallel investigation that had to be conducted in secret. At one point, Warren even stopped sharing leads and discussing the case with colleagues outside his inner circle. And these guys, Dammit and Hass, they're noteworthy because they were, the typical cops of the 50s, 60s, the kind of guys who catch criminals, playing, psychological games with the suspects. Bad cop, good cop. They think they're always right and must punish all the neighborhood's bad guys. Memorize their faces. They'll play an essential role in the investigation. Meanwhile, spending his nights in the squad room, the prosecutor took another look at the list of evidence collected. His attention stopped on the twine that the perpetrator had tied the 2 women together. According to some reports, Warren had used his money to buy a microscope and began scrutinizing the evidence. Thus, he discovered that 2 kinds of twine, consisting of 20 and 12 strands, had been used. They were tied together to make the rope stronger. Where could the criminal have gotten this rope? The first thing to do was to check the storerooms in the hotel. Without much difficulty, Warren found both kinds of twine in the kitchen in large spools. So he concluded that the rope with which the women were bound was no doubt from the stock in the hotel kitchen. At the prosecutor's suggestion, many of the hotel employees were again subjected to polygraph examinations. Faced with the fact that they had all passed the tests successfully and had not aroused any suspicion, Warren wondered if they had gotten the result. He decided it was time to run some tests of his own. He hired a specialist from a well-known Chicago firm and called in all the employees who had worked during the week the crimes had occurred for additional testing. One by one, the employees came up to a small shack on the hotel grounds and were tested. The first dozen passed the test with no problems, and then Warren and his assistants began to wonder again if they were wasting their time. Bill Dammit then invited a dishwasher named Chester Otto Weiger to come in. While checking on Weiger, Warren noticed that the face of the examiner conducting the examination had turned pale. He turned to the police officers and quietly said, "This is the man you want." Chester was a thin, short man. It's hard to imagine such a thing these days, but by the time he was 21, he had a wife and 2 small children. He had worked at the Park Hotel until the summer of 1960, and then quit to work with his father and become a house painter. Dammit remembered Chester's name from an earlier police report, and yet the young man had never been under the suspicion of the detectives. He was questioned on March 16th or 16, and Chester told his alibi then. At lunchtime on the day of the murder, he was alone in the hotel. The young man was writing a letter to his mistress. Chester said he picked up a pencil and paper at the front desk. Then, for some time, Uyghur was in plain view of everyone. He said he even turned up the music on the jukebox loudly. The appearance of the guy during the first interrogations was not accurately described. In later interviews with the police, they will say that there are scratches on his face, and whether someone noticed it, or whether the police themselves pointed it out, or whether there were no scratches at all. However, according to some sources, Chester has said he cut himself while shaving, and from that point on, Chester Uyghur would be the focus of all attention. On September 27th, Chester was taken to Chicago. Sheriff Dammit and Assistant State's Attorney Craig Armstrong did it. Chester was sent there for a polygraph test. John Reed was supposed to do it. It was to be his 6th so-called polygraph test. The officers questioned Chester for the rest of the next day until about midnight. They tried to coerce a confession out of him and used psychological pressure. But when Chester said, after hours of questioning, "You're following the wrong man," they let him go. But instead of taking the guy home, an assistant state's attorney interrogated him for another 4 hours. Warren decided to do a thorough background check on this young man. Let's get to know him too. Chester Uyghur was born in Iowa in the year 1939 to Herschel and Juanita Uyghur. The couple raised a total of 5 children. When Chester was 2 years old, they moved to Illinois. The Uyghur family lived very poor. There was no water in the house. Meat was mainly obtained by hunting. They grew their vegetables. Chester spent a lot of time outdoors. Such a childhood can hardly be called carefree. When Chester was 12, he was accused of sexualized violence. According to him, one day Chester was walking home after school and heard a child crying. It turned out it was a girl he knew well who was calling. She told him she had just been raped. Chester helped this girl get dressed, stopped the bleeding, and brought her home. However, the girl eventually pointed him out as the one who had attacked her. Chester pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to probation because he was a teenager at the time. However, this is also one of the confusing parts. Because the incident is officially recorded as an assault that Chester himself committed, and not from the words of the girl, but simply the documents even state that his parents saw traces of blood on his pants. So this only adds to his suspicion of what happened at Starved Rock Park. Well, one would imagine that's roughly what the detectives were thinking. Yep, he's capable of doing this, so basically he could have attacked these women. But what was strange was that Chester was cooperating with the police. He gave up his deerskin jacket so the lab could study the suspicious dark stains on it. And when asked about that jacket, he said, "Oh, I don't even know where it is right now. I think my wife put it on." And so it turned out they came home to pick up this jacket, and his wife was wearing it. And about those stains, it's unclear too. At first they thought it was the blood of an animal, a raccoon or a rabbit that Chester was hunting. Then they said no, it was human blood. But as far as you can see from the photographs and Andy Hale's description, it was just spatter. I mean, unhealthy droplets, not marks that they tried to wipe off and just embedded themselves, but little, tiny little droplets. The critical point was that there were no cleaning products or marks on the jacket. And then, this jacket had just an exciting fate. It was shown to everybody. It could be touched, scouted, and put on public display. Everybody could feel it, look at it, open it, close it, touch it in that tag. It's fantastic. And at the same time, it's so much like a case from the 60s. It's just classic. In one of the interviews, the detectives asked Chester if he'd taken the twine from the kitchen, and he answered without hesitation that sometimes he did because he needed it for fishing or hunting. He knew how to make traps out of rope in a unique way, and when Warren heard that, he couldn't believe his ears. Well, he admits that he did have the rope. It seemed to him that the key to solving the case was practically in his hands. After it was discovered that Chester's jacket had tiny drops of blood on it, Warren organized a permanent stakeout of Chester. He was followed for a month. Straight up stalked him and his family, but it accomplished nothing. At the same time, Warren, DeMette, and Haas began checking out reports of assaults in the Stardock neighborhood. Thus, DeMette came across a report of a rape and robbery that had occurred about 1.5 miles from Stardock in a nearby park called Madison. On September 13, 1959, a girl, her name withheld, went for a walk with her boyfriend. On one of the walks, as if out of nowhere, a young man with a shotgun jumped out at them. He ordered the girl to tie the boyfriend up with twine. She did so. The stranger then grabbed the girl and abused her. Afterward, she filed a police report. It is reported that Haas and DeMette then allegedly ignored the report and did nothing with it. And indeed, it didn't appear that anyone investigated the assault. Then, the teacher of the victimized girl, to whom Taras had told about the assault after hearing about the new case in Stardock Park, went to the police and recalled the September incident. Still, the assault is similar, and both could have a sexual motive. That's how Warren found out about the assault. With Warren's approval, the policeman approached the injured girl with a stack of photo slides. Slowly going through them, she saw Chester Wicker and cried out. The girl's boyfriend also identified the attacker, also from the photos. But interestingly enough, the photo in which both boyfriend and girlfriend identified Chester was a group photo, and Wicker was the only guy in his early 20s. The rest of the men were from a nearby prison and ex-convicts. 40s and older, grown men like that. I wonder why the detectives did this. And Chester denied the attack at first. But now Warren could have easily ordered Chester Wicker arrested on this one charge because the girl had identified him. But he had to wait. The fact was that Warren was up for re-election, and if he had charged Wicker with rape and murder right before the election, he would have been indicted by the defense attorney. They'd say he did it to keep his job. So, the prosecutor left Chester alone for a while. Warren had held the prosecutor's seat for about 8 years, but in the new election, another man took Warren's seat. The unsolved Stardock Park case affected the results, among other things. But Warren was still officially in office until December 1966, and could bring a case against Wicker. Although the evidence of Chester's guilt was not as conclusive as the prosecutor would have liked, he obtained a warrant for the boy's arrest. True, only on the charge of rape, which was in the 59th year. Warren ordered Haas and Deme to bring Wicker to the station. The prosecutor had carefully planned the interrogation of Chester with his assistants. Warren believed that when the suspect had seen all the evidence collected against him, he would confess the crime himself. So, on November 16th, around 18:00, Haas and Dame arrived at the young man's apartment and explained they had questions for him. They did not mention the arrest warrant, and once the detectives took Chester into custody, the questioning about the assault in Matheson Park began. Then, the partners started pressing him to plead guilty to the murder, too. Chester was held in an interrogation room until midnight. Then, weary of questions, an exhausted Wicker stopped for a half word and asked to see his family. A police car was dispatched to his parents' home. detectives decided that Chester wanted to confess to his loved ones. When the mother and father were taken to the station, DeMay and Haas allowed them a few minutes alone with their son. In his official statement the next day, Haas said, So Chester Wicker told everything he remembered about that day. On the morning of March 16th, Chester drove to work with a co-worker, as he did not have a car then. At the hotel, he set about his duties. He cleaned up the dishes for the guests after breakfast and lunch. At about 14:45, he began to take a short break. Chester took a short walk along the steep trail to St. Louis Canyon. There, he saw 3 women. Wicker decided to rob them. Mrs. Murphy's camera, which he mistook for a wallet, Wicker tried to take away at once, but the woman fought back. He grabbed the strap of the binoculars and tore it. The friends managed to fight back. Chester then somehow convinced the women that he wouldn't hurt them. He forced them to voluntarily follow him deep into the canyon, where they were trapped. Mrs. Lindquist said that Chester reminded her of her son, and that she did not believe this young man could harm them. According to Wicker, another woman stated that her husband was on the police force, and Chester would never get away with what he had done. In the cave, Chester said he would tie them up so he would have a chance to escape because they might recognize him. And to this, the women agreed. However, one of them, Miss Murphy, untangled herself and tried to follow him. She hit him over the head with her binoculars, and he turned around and hit her over the head with a branch he'd found. Chester thought the woman was dead. Her eyes were closed. He dragged her into the cave. When the other 2 women tried to free themselves to fight him back, he began beating them as well. When asked why he dragged the bodies into the cave, he said he noticed a small airplane flying low over the park. The aircraft was white and red. Chester was afraid it might have been a police plane, so he moved the bodies so they could not be seen from above. A few days later, the flight over the park was confirmed by the pilot's testimony and the flight log. As the young man finished his confession, Chester knew how to get out of the canyon quickly, which was also considered a red flag, confirming his direct involvement. Leaving the scene, Chester washed the blood off his hands and pants with snow and returned to work. No one at the hotel guessed that he had just committed something so gruesome. Within minutes, Chester Weiger transcribed and signed the confession on every page. Over the next few days, Chester confessed many more times to different people and even participated in an investigative experiment in the canyon. Reporters and police were there, and he showed exactly what he had done and how he had done it. Everyone who spoke to him noted the lack of even a shadow of remorse. Chester showed no emotion at all. And the case could end like this. There's a confession. It makes sense. There is no direct evidence, but it all adds up to a coherent picture. Except that on November 19th, after his first meeting with his court-appointed lawyer, not even 2 days after the confession, Chester declared himself not guilty, and that the confession had been beaten out of him. On November 22nd, he began to claim that he had been coerced into confessing to avoid the death penalty. He was threatened with the electric chair, so his confession is an absolute lie, and he signed the papers simply because he was scared. He said the detectives told him about the case. They showed him crime scene photos to make the confession believable. Specifically, he asked Mr. DeMitt to give him the information about the plane. Because Mr. Damit was a local aviation club member, he may even have flown this white and red airplane himself. Chester's family didn't believe he was guilty. His relatives told reporters that, in their opinion, Chester's confession was covering for someone, and he is not capable of such a thing. Later, Chester spoke of pressure not only on him, but also on his relatives. The police, on the other hand, denied the allegation of physical pressure and violence against the suspect. They reported that a doctor visited Weiger after the interrogations, and he would naturally have documented any bodily injury that had been inflicted. But the guy seemed to be perfectly fine. But to be fair, psychological pressure can't be felt or seen on the body. That's why it's such a controversial point. In the interrogation texts, there is one bizarre question that Chester Weiger was asked several times, over and over again, in different formulations. And Andy Hale noticed it. And when he just said that nobody paid any attention to it at all, and he was just casually leafing, and he was like, wow, what kind of question is that? Look, Chester is directly asked several times if he hit any of the women in the groin area, and Chester, having already made his confession and told everything, says, "No, I didn't beat anybody," right there. Then, the question is rephrased to mean these abrasions and bruises on Mrs. Murphy's body in the groin area. And Chester says, "No, I didn't hit her there. I didn't do anything to her at all." So why would he confess to such a brutal murder but not know anything about these bruises? Chester also didn't know that Mrs. Murphy had been defecated on, and the detectives asked him, "Did you urinate or leave feces on any of the women?" And Chester didn't understand the question at all. He confidently answered no to that question, even though he admitted it. Next, dark blonde hair was found on the glove of the same Mrs. Murphy and Mrs. Osing. Detectives analyzed them, and first, one lab said they were human hairs and most likely belonged to people of different ages, meaning one older and one younger. Then, the cops decided to send just one of these example hairs to some university, a very advanced lab. I mean, they sent only one hair, and it was a blonde hair. Guess why? Because Chester Weiger has blonde hair. It's like they only suspected him and were trying to tie him to the case. And by the way, that hair wasn't his. The blonde hair found at the crime scene was not Chester Weiger's. And that was never told to anyone. It was just, that's what they call it, buried in the paperwork. Andy Hale also found them by accident. Chester pointed to a branch as a weapon. And I think the most attentive and detective-minded of you have already noticed that it's very odd. Well, what branch? Especially if you know and have seen pictures of what happened there. Well, a branch can't do that kind of damage. And Chester didn't know that. Back on March 24th, the state lab said this branch couldn't have taken that kind of impact. This piece of wood was so rotten inside that it would simply break at the first blows. That's the official statement. But it wasn't sensationalized. It was just a newspaper article. And, well, Chester hadn't seen it and didn't know about this information. And the police didn't release that information to anyone. Chester didn't have a lawyer here to study these things and say, well, wait a minute. As we're now in the confession writing about this branch, and here's an official statement from the state lab saying that this branch is rotten inside. And if you hit it on the head, the branch will fly apart. One last thing, and this is one of the strangest parts of this whole story. The autopsy report found something very suspicious. It indicated that Mrs. Murphy, she was missing a phalanx. It was most likely cut off after her death. As we recall, Chester did not mention any such thing in his confession. He didn't have the finger on him either. It was cut off with a knife. And Chester didn't mention that weapon either. And the knife was never used in any of the murders. And have you noticed how many injuries or moments are connected to Mrs. Murphy? The bruising, the severed finger, the hair found on her glove, and that might seem pretty suspicious too. So, could Chester Weiger be innocent? That's what we will continue to find out in our next installment. It's coming out in just a few days. So for now, I'll leave you with all this information. Take your guesses. If you've heard about this case, write down what you think, and add to it if there's anything important you want to write. In the next installment, you and I will touch on a wealth of information, from the evidence in favor of Chester Weiger being guilty to the fact that Chester Weiger wasn't even close. And we will also go over some new information in this case. It's been how many years, though, hasn't it? 60, right? But this case lives on. And I just read something exciting the other day. And I can't wait to share it with you all, If you're looking forward to part 2, please give it a like. In the meantime, I'll be saying goodbye for a while. Good night, everyone, and goodbye.